What's going on, everybody? So this year I'm building my most ambitious prop yet. I'm building a 10-foot tall animated scarecrow or a skullcrow. Anyway, I just finished building the armature and the mechanism. Here's how I did it. To start this build, I need to make the scissor mechanism, and I'm using 3/4 inch square radius tubing, and the thickness, or the wall, is 1/8 inch thick. So it's pretty heavy duty stuff. I'm going to be using a lot of force, so I really wanted to make sure I got something that was going to be able to withstand the force of the pneumatic cylinder. So I'm using a special saw and saw blade to cut this steel. It does a much nicer job than a regular abrasive cutoff saw. Now, an abrasive cutoff saw spins at about 4,000 RPM. This spins much slower, and it's got a really big blade, 14-inch blade, and it cuts right through that steel very, very nicely. If you were to try to cut this steel with an ordinary chop saw with a blade meant for wood, you would have your own horror show. So don't try that. So if you're familiar with the channel, you know that I get pretty heavy into the details. For this build, since it's the only big build I'm doing this year, I figured I would be even more detailed and get into the why I'm doing something this way as opposed to that way, what materials I'm using. So if you want more content like this where I slow things down and explain in greater detail how I'm putting these props together, then leave a comment down below. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Now back to this. So you can see the clean cut that this particular saw blade makes in the metal. The reason I don't like the standard abrasive chop saw is it's really hard to get a perfectly 90-degree cut. The blade tends to kind of warp a little bit, and you can get kind of off-angled cuts. And this is going to be somewhat of a precision build, and I happen to have this saw, so it really works great for this job. So I've just marked all of my steel with this Magnum Sharpie, and then once it dries you can use a scratch awl to scribe a line, and it's a lot easier to see than actually using like a pencil or even a felt tip pen. So with that dark blue and the etched metal, it creates a sharp contrast, and it's a lot easier to see if you're using a drill press, or in my case I'm going to be using a mill to drill all my holes. So you could certainly use a drill press and set up a stop with some clamps to cut all these holes to make one of these mechanisms, but I have a mill with a heavy-duty vise, so I'm going to use that. I'm also using some cutting fluid to keep the surface lubricated and the drill bits somewhat cool. And I'm doing this in 2 steps, so I used a smaller bit first, and then I'm enlarging the hole with a larger bit. And the final dimension is 3/8 inches on these holes, and I'm going to use a 3/8 inch outer diameter steel spacer with an inner diameter of 1/4 inch, and I'll use stainless steel bolts to assemble the whole thing. So I probably could have made this rig with 16 inch or 16 gauge steel, but I went with 1/8 inch. I knew it was going to be a lot heavier, but I also knew it was going to be a lot stronger. The other reason I used it is because it gives me a lot more material to ensure that that spacer doesn't inadvertently pop out, because I will be using washers in between them. But I want to say for each linear foot of this material it weighs about a pound. So all in all there's about 20 feet of this, so the rig itself weighed about 20 pounds. So now I'm assembling the scissor mechanism. And you can see at the ends I've just used 1-foot sections, and then in the center those are all 2-foot sections. And again, the holes are 3/8 inch. There's a 3/8 inch spacer that's a 3/4 of an inch long, so it's the exact dimension as the square stock. And then I'm putting a nylon washer in between all of the joints. The stainless steel bolts are 1/4 inch, and they're 2 inches long. And then I'm securing everything with a single nylon locking nut with metal washers on both sides of the bolt. Now, before you point out that there's combustible wood below my welding table, I'm well aware I like living dangerously. I do have a fire extinguisher nearby, but I'm just welding up a steel bracket, and this is what I will use at the end of the shaft on the pneumatic cylinder to attach one leg on each side of the scissor mechanism. So I have the scissor mechanism all put together. When I first put it together, my end legs here were shorter than they should have been because I took these 2-foot sections and I just cut them in half to make the end legs. But what happened was when I went over about 3/4 of an inch or an inch for the bolt holes, the distance between these bolts was much shorter than the rest of the rig. So if you're making one of these, make sure you pay attention to that. The distance between your holes has to be the same throughout the rig. So what happened is it wouldn't collapse all the way. And my fear was that if there was too much slack on it and it fell down here, it could potentially create a jam, where if this started expanding, this would be inverted and it would possibly jam. So I just redid these end legs. Now it's all assembled correctly. And this is how this prop is going to work. So I have some tape laid out. This is 4 feet here. That's how much lift I want on the prop. This is 5 feet here. That's going to be the length of the pole. And this is a 12-inch pneumatic cylinder. It's 1 3/4 inch bore. I've had it for a long time. I just had it sitting around, haven't been using it. It's pretty big, and this is why I figured I'd use it for this prop. It's got 12 inches of throw, which means that's how much movement you have. It's 12 inches from here to here. So when I created the scissor mechanism, I was researching this. There was really no perfect formula for figuring out how big, how long your rails or your metal beams need to be. So I just kind of guessed. So these are 2 feet. From here to here is 2 feet, and then the smaller legs are just over 1 foot. But this is the key to these. This is really inconsequential, the length of your legs. It just depends on how big of a prop you're activating. What's more important is how much throw you have and how many sections you have. So because I want this to raise 4 feet when it's activated, I knew I only have 1 feet of throw for this. And if this is pulled down for 1 foot, each section will go up 1 foot. But the way I'm using this prop or this mechanism is there's going to be a pivot point. There's a little piece of blue tape right here. And this will be attached to the pole. So this is how it will look static. When it's activated, this will retract. This, of course, will be attached to the bracket and will slide out. So I have 1 foot of throw here, but that is not in play because this is below where the pivot point is. So I knew I needed 4 sections, 1, 2, 3, 4, for 1 foot of throw each, and that gets me the 4 feet of throw that I'm looking for. So for the post, I'm using a 2-inch prefabricated fence post that you can buy at like Home Depot. So I cut it to length. This is just a little section. And how this works is this is the pivot point here. This will attach to the post. And the post, it will be screwed into some plywood and anchored to the ground. Now this is only 16 gauge steel. It's not as thick as I would like. So I knew I needed like a bolt assembly that was didn't have a lot of slop in it, otherwise it could start bending on the steel and everything. And you could certainly use spacers and different size bolts, but because I already cut 3/8 inch holes everywhere, I figured, and I have the shop and the machinery to do this, I figured I would just try making my own for something different. So I took a 1/2 inch piece of steel and I machined it into this bolt assembly. And I'll show you how I made it. So as I mentioned before, this prop is going to have a tremendous amount of force placed on it by this pneumatic cylinder. So I knew that that pivot point needed to be really strong. I had already drilled 3/8 inch holes throughout the scissor mechanism, but I really felt like it needed something bigger to go through the steel post that actually holds the entire armature up. So I decided to make my own bolt, and what I'm using is just a piece of 1/2 inch steel, and I'm going to mill it over on the lathe to basically mimic exactly what I need. So part of it will be 1/2 inch. I'll turn down the other part to 3/8 of an inch, and then I'll cut some threads into it and mill the other end so that I can get a wrench around it to tighten up a lock nut. So now I'm just milling the other end of the bolt so that I can actually get a wrench around it to tighten up the lock nut. So I'm just milling one side, and then I'm going to flip it over 180 degrees and I'll mill the other side. So how this is going to work, put this here, is I'm going to drill a 1/2 inch hole through and through, and then this will go into the 1/2 inch hole like this. These collars get attached one at each end, and then I milled a groove for the set screws, and then you just tighten the set screws. I machined this part so that you can get a wrench around it, so you can attach a nylon locking nut to it. So this shaft right here, while this is 1/2 inch, this is 3/8 inch, and that's the hole that goes through this steel. So I'll just remove this bolt assembly, and this whole section goes into that bolt assembly and gets attached to the post, and that's how the prop pivots. So I'm carefully measuring and marking where the center of this 2-inch post is, and then I'm using something called a center punch to make a small divot in the metal, and that way when you use a drill bit it doesn't wander off. I'm going to start by drilling a small hole with a center drill bit, and then I'll use something known as a step bit to get up to that 1/2 inch. So I just kind of threw some plywood together with some scrap wood just because I needed something down and dirty to put the armature up, to get everything aligned and assembled, just to see if this would actually even work. So I've got a 2x4 there with a hole drilled out in the center, just using a Forstner bit, and that's because the bottom of that cylinder is threaded, and I've threaded it into a 1-inch flange, and I'll just secure the flange with some screws and secure the 2x4 onto the plywood with some screws. So if you notice, this bolt assembly is kind of blue in color now, and that's because I heat treated it and oil treated it just so that it would prevent rust, or at least resist rust, because it will be outside. So I'm just putting the collars on the bolt now and then tightening those set screws so it doesn't move. So getting the scissor mechanism on this bolt was kind of challenging by myself, so I had to kind of tilt it at a funky angle, but I eventually got it figured out. So all of these bolts are relatively tight, but not so tight that the mechanism binds up. So usually I just tighten it fairly tight, and then I'll back it off just a little bit so everything can still move freely. So just a little proof of life here, and it works. And then I just took a quick measurement to see how much lift I really got. There's a little slack in this armature as it kind of relaxes a little bit, which is a little hard to predict when you have it laid out on the ground like I did. But I ended up getting just about 50 to 51 inches of lift. So pretty good, pretty happy with that. So the next part of this build will be attaching a big 4-foot drawer slide that will attach on the other side of that post, and that will keep that armature, that scissor mechanism, nice and vertical so that it doesn't scrape or kind of move if there's heavy wind or anything like that. And then I'll build the aluminum armature that will be the top or the main part of the Skullcrow. So stay tuned, hit the like button and that subscribe button if you want to see future content and the update on this build.